And thank you all for joining us from our local and global art communities all over the world. I thought about the famous French Salon and how it was supposed to be run, and someone said it should sort of follow Horace's definition of what poetry should aim for, and that should be to please or to educate. And I hope we will get a bit of both here today. So Art for Collaborative Future is it's a new platform that promotes dialogue across the world, dialogue connecting the global with the local. And its aim is to put the art world in touch with people and new ideas and to inspire each other. How can we navigate the effects of the corona crisis and find new ways to support the art scene and bring art into our everyday lives and promote dialogue and visibility to artists? I'm Sofia Bertilsson, and I'm an international art advisor. I'm connected to the art fair Arco in Lisbon, to their VIP programs. And I also founder of the PR agency, The Contemporary Art Insider. First, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our panel here today, our special guest, I should say, and who will share their experiences around the theme today that you also very generously have helped to shape: memory, legacy, collaborations. And this is a discussion that will start in Georgia, Ukraine, and Serbia. But I think it will take us far beyond. Our guests today are Alex Fisher, who is a writer and curator from Buffalo, New York, currently residing in Kyiv, where he's researching Ukrainian contemporary art as a Fulbright scholar. He has led and supported initiative for the Estate of Ana Mendieta via Galerie Lelong, the Albright-Knox Art Gallery, Yoko Ono Studio One, and Wanås Konst. And he contributes to magazines like Kajet, This is Badland, Guest Rooms, VONO, and Print. You find him on Instagram as Walex Fisher. Irena Popiashivili is the Dean and founder of Visual Arts Architecture. No, did I miss something? Visual Arts Architecture and Design School, VALS, at the Free University of Tbilisi. Thank you, Irena. Since returning to her native Georgia 8 years ago, Irena has become a primary connector between Georgia, art scene, and the rest of the art world. In Georgia, she orchestrates exhibition and has established the roving Kunsthalle Tbilisi, an institution that exhibits radical artworks and supports Georgia-based artists. She has been a gallerist in New York, co-owning the Newman Popiashivili Gallery, and served as the director of the State Academy of Arts in Tbilisi. And she has also curated exhibitions in the US and in Europe, such as the Georgian pavilions at the Venice Biennale in 1999 and 2003. Vladimir Miladinović is an artist invited by Alex Fisher. He is living and working in Belgrade, Serbia, and he is the laureate of the 53rd October Salon Award. He works extensively with politics of memory, and he has exhibited widely across Europe and the United States. He is represented by the gallery Oyster Belgrade, where his latest body of work is on view until the end of the month. Irena Popiashivili has invited Nino Kvrivishvili, who is a young Georgian artist living and working in Tbilisi. She has exhibited extensively in Georgia and abroad. She makes hand-woven wool tapestry that resemble large-scale paintings. Before the advent of textile industry, rugs were woven in almost all regions of Georgia. She's also using her family's history in her work, as well as the complex process of buying wool and weaving, and of course of the people that she comes across and their histories. Some of you might have read the articles about Tbilisi and the Silk Road and the silk industry in a recent issue of Tea magazine. And I think you might be through that and other readings, you might be familiar with a very rich cultural heritage of Georgia and connections to, and especially the textile heritage. Nino is found on Instagram as @Nino Kvrivishvili. So thank you for being here, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing you talk. And I'm so thankful for you being here to share your thoughts, and of course for the audience who's tuning in, please feel free to post questions using the chat function. And after about 30 minutes, we will open the salon for everyone to raise their hand and post questions and so on. If there's someone that you would like to invite, we have posted the invite to the Zoom meeting on in the chat, so you can find it there and share it with a friend. So we will record the first 30 minutes, and after that, during the open salon, we will stop the recording. And the person making all of this possible is our wonderful coordinator, Hanna Öjevall, who is a young curator. She is currently working at Lunds Kunsthall, and her participation is made possible through Konstfrämjandet Skåne, the People's Movement for Art Promotion, an organization who works towards the mission Art for Everyone. So the last few months, a few of us have traveled, and I realized that we came up with the Salon as a way of meeting people and learning from their experiences and trying to create real contact between us. Thinking of the future also involves the past. Legacy and memory are very strong words with different meanings. In the art world, the museums have been the pillars of memory and legacy. But whose legacy and whose memories? How do we learn from artists to create and build our future? So today, our curiosity will take us to Georgia, Ukraine, and Serbia. And I would like to start with Alex, currently in Ukraine, and Vladimir in his hometown of Belgrade, and ask you to think about memory and legacy and how we can find collaborative ways of working.
Definitely.
So could you expand on this and how we can create and collaborate?
For sure, for sure. Well, for starters, it's a real pleasure to connect with all of you today. I think each and every one of you has been played a really inspirational role for me and committing to this line of inquiry in these subjects. So it's a real pleasure and privilege. And I'm calling in today from Lviv in southern Ukraine, which I think in the built character of the city embodies a lot of these subjects we'll be talking about, and that you have on one block, you will have an Austro-Hungarian building next to Polish building, next to Soviet building, next to contemporary building trying to be something in Brooklyn or Berlin or something like this. So it's, I would say for starters, is that definitely contemporary Ukraine embodies this inherent intersectionality of this topic. So it's a real motivation for me. And with regards to my work, I'm primarily focused on intersections between politics of memory, monumentality, and the built landscape. Ukraine is a huge territory and is territorially the largest country in Europe. And yet it often is spoken about in rather one-dimensional or stereotypical manner. So for me, it's been an interesting process living this past year and coming in with a lot of embodied expectations and then opening myself up to nuance. So I shared with Hanna one postcard that if she could share, if possible, to start, that I think speaks about some of the things which occupy my attention. But anyways, as she pulls this up, I will introduce this idea in that a lot of what I speak about in my research is communication and communication across time and space. And this example I bring up is around an artist, Nikita Kadan, who works a lot across time. And in this example, he writes on a postcard doing an image. Aha, here we go. So what you see here is a postcard documenting the Ivan Aivazovsky Museum in Simferopol in Crimea, which is now been occupied and annexed illegally by Russian forces. And in this card, you see a hallmark of Russian Empire, Ukrainian cultural identity from the past few centuries, embodied in something which no longer exists. And on the reverse of the postcard, which you see here, Nikita has written Vernity Krim Vukmitov, which translates to English as Return Crimea to Kmitiv. And I raise this example because Kmitiv is a place about an hour outside the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, which has one of the world's largest collection of socialist realism. And in reclaiming the Aivazovsky postcard and saying it should be brought back to Kmitiv, Nikita raises a really keen topic about, to what extent is a cultural object have substantive meaning in a moment when the territory it represents has been stolen away to you. So it's this question around agency and impact. And this raises why I invited Vladimir. And it's not only because Vladimir and Nikita were roommates several years ago on a residency, but this sort of speaking across place and inhabiting voices of history in the present are key aspects of what Vladimir is working on. And in an effort to not speak for him, which he is obviously better to speak about than me, I will prompt Vladimir around his work, Rendered History, which you'll see one piece from here. And maybe Vladimir, you can introduce the body of work.
Thank you, Alex, for this introduction, and thank you all for inviting me. I'm really glad to be part of it. I have to say at the very beginning that I'm not very experienced with these Zoom meetings, and it can.
Temporary.
So I think we lost him there temporarily, but maybe if you can continue. Yeah, Hanna, could you just see if you lost the connection there?
But anyways, I can briefly introduce the body of work. This is a body of work called Rendered History, which Vladimir received 53rd Oktobarsky Salon Prize for. It's a body of work in which he looks at competing narratives as embodied in newspaper publications. And a lot of the subjects are around the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the conflicts and competing narratives associated with it. So for example, he will take El País, a Spanish newspaper, and compare the headline documenting this atrocity or this event to how the Belgrade press is covering the same subject, or how the Sarajevo press is covering the same subject, or how Frankfurter Allgemeine is doing it. And so it's a pretty, it's showing like how tight narratives are interwoven with one another, and also like shows the limits of how authoritative these documents are. And so, yeah, it's also become a hallmark of Vladimir's practice to do ink wash tracing of the subjects. So it's this extraordinarily time-consuming process of creating the scans, creating the documentation, and then doing it piece by piece by piece by piece. And then upon doing so, he then installs the work in a horizontal manner. So an object which is usually contained, like a news object that you can hold your hands on, is then blown up to a huge scale. And it becomes something that becomes bigger than the human reader. And so this, to me, is quite interesting in this topic of what we're discussing around memory and legacy, because it's not talking about memory and legacy that as something that exists in a file or in an archive, but it exists as something that is larger than life. It's something that hasn't withdrawn or minimalized over history. Its detail has become bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is one example, and then Hanna can show one other work while we're waiting on Vladimir. But yeah, it's a pretty fascinating body of work, and it gets us started, in a sense, into this dialogue.
And these are drawings, or how they are?
Yeah, so it's ink wash. It's ink wash on heavy paper. So there is an element of let's say fragility to the work, but the work is always hung behind glass in a blonde frame. So there's also a sort of containment around the piece that's done in this process.
And are they actual size of the paper?
Yeah, there's no manipulation of the scale in the work. Everything is very direct.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
I think we have Vladimir back with us now.
Yeah?
He was,
yes.
But then he disappeared again.
Yeah.
Oh no!
Yeah.
So maybe, yeah, I can see that. So he's having some sort of problem with the connection, probably.
Yeah.
So it's so those drawings, they are the same scale as the original newspaper, right?
Yeah. So like I said, it provides this this balance between something that is an immediate impression versus something with how he then installs them in a gallery context or museum context into something that takes on a much larger scale. So it's questions around intimacy in terms of owning legacy versus legacy being something bigger that can be contained. Yeah.
I think also that his current show at Orchestra Belgrade is actually ink drawings of Ratko Mladenović secret notebooks, right? 400 pages that he.
Exactly, and so this is a subject that has become something of a hallmark, or something that is a repeated line of inquiry in Vladimir's work, is about not only bringing these documents that document atrocity into a cultural discourse, but also about inhabiting the pen or inhabiting the mindset of the author. And this is something that I often think about when encountering his work is, you know, these are histories that are in one sense a lived history, that, like, coming from Serbia, it's a recent history, but then the difference between being an audience member to that history or being an author of that history, or being a co-author of this history. And these are roles that he inhabits in all their dimensions in his practice. So yeah, if you want to maybe show one work from the notebook, then this would be appropriate. Yeah, so I will briefly introduce this series. This work is currently on view at Oyster in Belgrade. It's a product of multiple years of rather intense work. It's page by page recreation, or recreation is, for lack of a better word, of Ratko Mladić, who was a Serbian warlord, his notebook in which he documented military strategies, political strategies, you know, sort of superfluous day-to-day activity all in one place. And this notebook was then taken by the United Nations War Crimes Tribunal and digitally rendered into, yeah, he's back, great, brilliant.
Please,
Vladimir, can you hear me?
yeah, please, sorry for the inconvenience, but
no, it's been
No
quite
worries.
nice because we've been talking about how this sort of perpetual question in your work around authorship and about who claims authorship to these subjects, how you are in one sense re-authoring or recontextualizing, and then me, due to our global technical reality, have had to channel some of your mindset in my own discussion. So it's a good challenge, but it raises to something that a point I was starting to talk about. But now that you're back, would be great if you could continue around specifically with the notebook, talking about the distance or proximity to the original document by product of the journey that document has taken from its home in a wall in his apartment to the United Nations, and then now into your hands.
Sure. So maybe it's important to just quickly explain that, like, there is the original notebook among 18 of his wartime military notebooks, where he was neatly writing every single day the meetings that he had, like the other, you know, needs of the army, etc., etc. So, like, since the beginning of the war in '92 until the end in '95, he was writing practically every day practice of his and his colleagues. So in 2010, the team of investigators found in one of his Belgrade houses a fake wall behind which they found all these personal notebooks, but not just this, but also like phone recordings where he was recording all the phones that he was leading with other militaries and with the president of Serbia, etc., etc., trying to back him up because they committed a lot of war crimes, obviously, in the 90s, and they knew what they are doing. So they found the original notebook. So this is like a very simple a notice where he was like writing with pencil on paper, like everyday meetings. So there is this original book which was used as the evidence. But in order for this evidence to become a proof, the court had to engage a team of witness experts and graphologists to practically adjust this original handwritten document into a document that can be used in front of the court. So the graphologists had to transcribe every single letter, every single sentence in Serbo-Croatian, and then they had to translate everything in English so that the international court can actually read it and understand it. So at the very beginning, speaking of the authorship, like there is also the relation between the evidence from one side and the proof from the other side. So what is evidence? What is proof? And for me, this distinction is very important. As I said, like the evidence had to be adjusted in order to become a proof that can be used in the court. And in my work, I decided to use this final document. On the screen, I think you can see one of the drawings that they made, but you can see that the drawing is pretty much technical, as the graphology experts had to retype every written sentence on computer. So they created this Times New Roman 12 size font Word document that is very clear. It's very clear what is it written over there. There is no mistakes. Everything is cleared from his personal handwriting, like his senses of the pressure of the pencil. You can't see anything of this. Even when he was circling something with his hand, this was also transformed in these computerized curves that are very straight and very, very clear. So what I did is actually what I'm usually doing in my artistic practice. When I lost electricity, I don't know why, it never happened, and now it happened during this meeting. I just lost electricity for 5 seconds. So I think that on the screen was one of the newspaper pages.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, this one, exactly. So this is important because this is how years ago I started. So I don't know if I have time to briefly explain about the practice.
Yeah.
Well, Alex gave a rather good introduction. So
okay.
where you can, if you say would like to say something about the front pages of the newspapers, I see it's very much a way of different versions of memory, perhaps.
Yes.
Or
yes.
how's your relation there with how, because you're working a lot with the past, right? But how does it translate into the now and into the future?
So this is practically a very important question for my work, because my initial idea was not to make this huge series of handwritten drawings in ink wash, but rather I was pretty much interested in this idea of trying to find the references of my personal memory toward this very traumatic history that we shared back in the 90s when I was a little kid. And even though I was never involved in any wartime events, I grew up in this small city in central Serbia. My dad was never invited to go and fight in the war. So I don't have this kind of empirical, personal experience, but I do have knowledge about this past. And I'm pretty much interested in the references of my knowledge. So I started researching different archives in order to find the references of my personal memory. And I realized, as I don't have this personal wartime experience, but I do have knowledge, this knowledge is actually coming through the mass media, through the products of mass media, of a dominant culture from the country where I'm living now, where I grew up. And I decided to start visiting the archive of a daily newspaper. And I started ordering specific titles writing about certain periods from the 1990s. And I started reading this. And then while I was reading this in the archive, my childhood childhood memory started like reviving. So I started collecting all these pages without a specific idea how and what am I going to do with this. But this very process of reading and researching this archive was very important for me. And I wanted to make a work of art where I would be able to make this process of reading visible somehow. So I made a few tests and I started rewriting the entire content of, for example, here we have this newspaper page. So I would find an article I'm interested in, and then I would scan the whole page, I would transfer it on paper, and then I started slowly rewriting letter by letter, word by word, even the pictures and everything. So for me, this was more as a performative act, like a process of dealing with this traumatic past, as a process of, let's say, digesting this material rather than producing an art. And as the outcome of this process, we have this artifact, which is the outcome of the process, which is the drawing that we are now.
Which could be you could share with with other people. Exactly. I actually would like to. Sorry.
Yeah.
I actually thought that it's interesting, like how this with you could say collective memory, but also very personal memory and history. I actually thought it would be interesting to continue with Irena and Nino. I know Nino also works a lot with both personal history and a more collective history.
Yeah.
So Irena and Nino, could you reflect a bit on how to collaborate and create and sort of understand the future and what memory and legacy means to you in that process? Irena, I know that I think you will also show some works by other Georgian artists in this section. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. First of all, it's such a pleasure to participate and to be here with all of you. I guess I wanted can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to start with a brief introduction with this video, which I think is only 30 seconds will be enough to see it. It was made by a young artist who actually studied and graduated from VADS, from Visual Arts Architecture and Design School, and it's called Marshutka Gestures. So why I think it's an interesting piece also to start talking about Georgian art is because Marshutka is this typical like a mini bus that is an official transportation form in Georgia. And there are certain routes that these marshutkas, they are usually yellow, that they travel, in the city. But you can stop them anywhere. And these are the gestures that people use to stop it. And you see, like, it's in a way very interesting to me and also like humoristic because unless you know what you're looking at, it's very difficult to understand what they are doing and what you're looking at. And in a certain way, I mean, I'm using this as a metaphor of why sometimes I feel that Georgian art needs an introduction in a way, translation. Incidentally, when I was doing, when we are working right now and with the students, we're organizing in an hour, actually, we have a first exhibition, real exhibition opening, which is end of the semester. And what was the most kind of surprising thing, because it's been a semester of teaching online, and Nino is also one of the professors at the university. It was a translation from virtual to real, because when the students started bringing in the work, even though we've seen them online in Zoom, you're immediately surprised by the scale and by the texture, which, it doesn't translate during these pandemic times. We are looking at things, online, and it's a different thing when you see something in reality. The second, speaking of memory and legacy, I wanted to show you this image of a young artist, also former student, and this is called Playground on Hinomi Valley. It's a really interesting thing because, you know, somehow there's a lot of commentary about having this history of political art and, you know, being part of Soviet Union, and then before that being, you know, colony of Russia, etc. What's happening nowadays is there is this crawling occupation that the Russian forces are doing in Georgia in occupied parts. So it's literally like you hear every like second week that the border has been moved for like a kilometer or half a kilometer, and the villages or the Georgian territory, you know, is ending up in being Russian territory, occupied Russian territory. So this is a piece that this young artist did on July 15th, actually 2 years ago. It's the day of the FIFA World Cup soccer match final. At the same time when it was happening in Moscow, this match was taking place then. And what he did is like he found out that in one of the villages there is a so-called quote-unquote museum that the villagers call, because one woman has collected the artifacts.
Sorry, I didn't hear what did they call the museum?
So in this village,
yes.
There's this lady like who lives there, and she has collected 2008 Georgia-Russia war, you know, bombed or burned objects, and she put that in this house and called it a museum. I mean, yes. Go figure. So what he did, he went and asked this woman if he could borrow these artifacts from this quote-unquote
he borrowed the museum.
Yeah, he borrowed the museum and brought them, and this is a playground in the center of the city where he installed this war, you know, camp, and displayed these materials there. So it was sort of like, you know, what I like about it, this is a contemporary interpretation what political art could look like, as considering the history of what political art looked in countries like ours. And then last one, it's like, of course, there are many, you know, very interesting artists that I wanted to show you, but what I want to, like one brief, the second image, what I want you to see is this artist, Georgi Khaniashvili, which is a very interesting combination of Georgian historical sort of Christian art and mixture of like Soviet iconography. So it's a weird combination of these two iconographies. He's currently his work part of the exhibition that's at Ujazdowski Castle in Warsaw that Slavs and Tatars curated. It was part of the Crack Up, Crack Down, you know, Ljubljana biennial, and now this exhibition traveled to Warsaw. And if you could show Hanna the next image, the sculpture, that would be great. And what's interesting is also to know that it's still, people a lot of time think that wood is a Georgian material, and Georgians never use wood in, you know, historically, because we were invaded too many times and it was very easily destroyed material, and B, it's not a traditional Georgian material. But this guy works in wood and creates these very interesting sculptures and reliefs. Lastly, but not least, I would like now to invite Nino.
Okay, thank you, Irena, and thank you everyone for inviting me for this talk. It's a pleasure. I will speak about my recent project I did with curator Tara McDowell, the project called Incidents of Travel, Tbilisi. The project is organized by Kajet and by Latitudes Barcelona. The organization which are mostly focused, they are most focused on contemporary art, on different issues in contemporary art. So I'm very glad that among very interesting places done by Kajet, you see like Rio de Janeiro, like Chicago or Yerevan, you see Tbilisi story there. So what about the project? It's like was like a conversation. It was like a dialogue between one curator and one artist. So originally it was planned that Tara was planning to come to Georgia to have this one-day itinerary, but due to this coronavirus, she could come, and she was staying in Australia, and she was answering my WhatsApp calls. So it was quite unusual circumstances. We worked during one-day itinerary, but I lead her through the places in a city which interested me most and which somehow had a huge influence on my practice. If we can see now several images, I'll try to describe how we started. We've been, and so the former silk industry in a city which is totally empty now, but on the small part is occupied by young startups and some construction companies, and huge beautiful yard is covered with mulberry trees. We've been to a really wonderful fabric shop where the owner, the man, Alexandra, works there more than 30 years and preserves this unique place. We went to DIY market, which was actually created after the industry was appeared without any jobs. So they started selling some objects, bartering with goods, and that's how it was created. And during the one-day itinerary, also visited State Silk Museum, which is really beautiful and unique place in Tbilisi, which preserves all these treasures. The museum is mostly focused on sericulture, on silk, and it was first which was established in a region. And during one-day itinerary, of course, I came back to my studio at the end, and on the way I stopped in front of the bakery where when people normally buy Georgian bread, shotis puri. It's somehow the different space with traditions, and I ended up my tour itinerary in my studio where I had a talk about my work. So why I have chosen these places I already mentioned. So I'm too much attached to these places. I'm interested in the topic of migration, of displacement in industry, and people who worked in industry, and all these themes are the part of my works. And mentioning about the Silk Museum, I want to say that I was really happy to show her this place, as I had honored within Irena to make a show in 2016 in Silk Museum, where I did my first silk sculptures with abandoned objects and combined them with Soviet era silks. Yeah, this is a former silk industry which is in the city center, and you see how it looks right now. And on the left you see the fontaine, which is totally empty, and it's so quiet around. It's like a silence of court. And if you go through the next quickly, I will tell you. So this is a main central avenue in Tbilisi where the former fabric shops used to locate it in the near past, and now you see it's totally changed. And in 2016, when Irena was curating a show called Soviet Rainbow, from textile shop to museum, we did a show in, maybe Irena will talk about this project.
I think I'll just quickly say that, while you're looking, what's interesting about this Kadist travel incidents, if Hanna, you could change the slides, it's really, you will see sort of bits and pieces of Tbilisi when you've never been to the city, and it's the view how Nino sees it, and is connected to the silk industry and her interest in silk. So what we did back then, because in Tbilisi everybody knew where these silk shops or the fabric shops were. So what Nino did when we did the exhibition in 2016, we sort of placed these posters of this exhibition with the images of her work as posters in the places where these shops were before. So Tbilisi residents who knew the city, they immediately recognized what they were looking. So it was an interesting mapping of the city, considering its history and where the locations of this, non-existing textile shops, now sort of non-existing textile shops were. And I think it's also quite interesting that Nino that was saying that Tara McDowell really pointed out how actually virus and you know, coronavirus is connected with the discovery of the existence of virus is connected to the silkworms. And I had no knowledge of it, but the museum is one of the most interesting places in Tbilisi, and we've done 2 exhibitions now there together with Nino.
Nino, I actually would like to move on to you. In your work, you use silk and wool, and you refer to the long tradition of weaving in Georgia and also in other former Soviet states, but also to your family's history. I thought about the ancient Nordic mythology. There is the 3 Norns, and they are spinning, and they are actually snipping off your life thread. One is called Urd, which means the past. One is called Verdandi, meaning what is coming into being. And the third one is called Skuld, meaning what shall be. By using silk and wool and weaving, you weave histories and memories, also involving other people and their histories. But how is the future reflected in your work? So what shall be?
It's quite interesting Nordic mythology you were talking about. Speaking about the woven stories and about its future, about the process and about the future. So at the beginning you mentioned about the industry in Georgia before the advent of textile industry in Georgia. So it was quite traditional to make rugs and carpets all around the country. And I actually always wanted to work with textiles, with hand-woven textiles and with printed textiles. And also it's quite interesting, which I realized quite late, that when I started studying textile design, I was really thinking to make a sketch and for the industry, but it didn't happen because the industries were gone, but it was developed in different ways. So now I'm in my studio and doing my hand-woven piece you see behind, which you mentioned I started during this pandemic, and hopefully it will be finished, and this year will be finished very soon with positive results, and I will finish this work very soon. And actually the material, the story behind material, behind wool and the silk is connected also with one story which happened not so long ago, but I bought very beautiful old rug from Tusheti and Shepherd. It's a place in high mountains of Georgia where it's quite common to see beautiful hand-woven old rugs, but nowadays people are not doing anymore. He was selling this rug to make this wool coat called nabadi. When the shepherds are in mountains, they use this coat. And in return, I bought the wool from the same shepherd. So I started weaving the history. So you see almost the same picture here, but with a new date to 2020.
Yes.
Here, and the name written in Georgian, my name in Georgian. So the same tactic with this abstract images. I did 2 pieces from 2018, and next was in 19, and this is the 3rd one. And I scribed my name there and the date of its date done. So it's somehow the story of its completion.